Caligula is a somewhat troublesome historical figure. He has been presented to history as a despotic madman who, through his erratic behaviour, was vehemently despised by his people, so much so that he had to be taken out of the picture by one of his own guards some 4 years into his authoritarian reign. The sordid stories of his life have been passed down the centuries as examples of how not to rule an empire, but perhaps this has been unfair. It is true to say that he was not what we would today class as a good and pious ruler, but we are discussing a man ruling in a very different world almost 2,000 years ago. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus to members of the elite Roman society. His father was Germanicus, a hugely popular general and grandnephew of Augustus, while his mother Agrippina was a member of the ruling Julio-Claudian dynasty. During infancy, Gaius would accompany his father on military pursuits and would be dressed up as a soldier. The troops enjoyed this and gave the infant the nickname Bootykins, which in the native Latin is Caligula. When Germanicus died in Antioch at the premature age of 34, Agrippina, the 7-year-old Caligula, and the rest of his siblings returned to Rome, where an ongoing feud with the emperor and adoptive uncle of Germanicus ensued. The result was the decimation of the family, with Caligula the sole male survivor. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Caligula became emperor of Rome, aged just 24. The population of Rome were delighted by their new emperor, and his presence was celebrated in the city. The ancient historian Suetonius wrote of the early part of his reign, "He fulfilled the highest hopes of the Roman people, or I may say, of all mankind, since he was the prince most earnestly desired by the great part of the provincials and soldiers, many of whom had known him since his infancy, as well as by the whole body of the city populace, because of the memory of his father Germanicus and pity for a family that was all but extinct." This in part had as much to do with the fact that Tiberius had retreated to his country residence at Capri for the last decade of his reign. The people finally saw their emperor. The early acts of his reign were spent reviving the memory of his departed family members. He retrieved the ashes of his mother and brother and ordered circus games and funeral sacrifices in their honour as members of the Augustan line. He recalled the senators who had been banished under the rule of Tiberius and gave authority back to magistrates who had previously needed the say-so of the emperor to make decisions. He further enhanced his reputation with the people by holding games in the city and staging plays, and added an extra day to the festival Saturnalia. He issued monetary rewards to every citizen of the city and to the Praetorian Guard. Things had started well for the young emperor, who had quickly appeased the Senate, and by virtue of being the son of one of Rome's most celebrated generals, and the mere fact that he was not his predecessor Tiberius, had won over the populace of Rome. Stories of the early part of his reign seem in stark contrast to the ruler Suetonius called the monster. Firstly, the money he so generously shared with his people was not from an endless supply. Despite Tiberius's lack of love for his people, he had left the Roman coffers bursting with money. Within a year, Caligula had bankrupted Rome, spending a whopping 270 million sesterces. Suetonius tells us that Caligula attempted to raise funds by wickedly ingenious methods, inventing more taxes, making false accusations, and holding auctions. He made every citizen amend their will and make him an heir, so that he would receive money on their death. He gained money through the sales of gladiators and made a fortune by selling off jewellery, furniture, slaves, and even freedmen while in Gaul. So he was pretty bad with money, but his monstrous reputation was yet to appear. The turning point was twofold. In October 37, just 8 months into his reign, the emperor fell gravely ill. His closest advisors, thinking only of themselves, readied a young replacement of their choosing in the likely event of Caligula's death. However, the emperor did not die. In fact, he made a full recovery, and feeling betrayed, he sentenced the men to death. The second turning point was the death of his beloved sister Drusilla. After she had passed in the summer of 38, he left Rome for a period of time, travelling in the south. Back in the city, a senator claimed he had seen Drusilla ascend to the heavens, and upon his return, Caligula rewarded the man and deified Drusilla. He erected life-sized golden statues of her in the Senate House and Temple of Venus Genetrix. After this, his behaviour became more erratic and despotic. It was not only his sister that he wanted to deify. Unfulfilled with being a mere emperor, he wanted deification during his own lifetime, something usually reserved for the emperor until after their death. Caligula insisted upon famous statues of gods from all over the empire be remade in his image. He also seems to have taken on a sense of paranoia over his status. Rome, of course, at one time in its history was a republic, and only became a dictatorship during the reign of Augustus some 50 years before the reign of Caligula. So the age of the emperor was a somewhat new phenomenon in Rome, when at the dinner table in front of a group of foreign kings, Caligula announced, "Let there be one master and one king." It was here that his courtiers reminded him that despite not being a king in name, he was the most powerful man in the room. His paranoia was heightened when he discovered a plot to kill him had come from consuls, army commanders, and even members of his own family. After this, he increased the hatred directed towards these people. He very deliberately set out to belittle, humiliate, and abuse the Senate and aristocracy. He began to use his power to engage in sexual behaviour with the wives of his senators, and would choose any moment he felt necessary to do this. He would then return to the room and tell her husband all the details of what had just happened. Much is made of the debauched nature of his reign, and it is true to say that Caligula turned the palace into a brothel, and used high-born women and men in it. These were the sons and daughters of the aristocracy, and this was surely another act of humiliation aimed at the higher class. It must have sent shockwaves through the houses of the ruling families. That such a thing could happen in the house of Augustus was unthinkable. Shock was a tactic he employed quite regularly to upset the upper class. He was looked down upon for engaging in a same-sex relationship with the actor by the name of Nestor. But of course, context is important. He was not thought wrong for having merely had a same-sex relationship. The issue with Caligula's relationship with Nestor was the man's profession. Actors were thought of as the lowest of the low in Rome, part of the infamed class who did not have the same rights as other Roman citizens. They were barred from certain legal privileges and could never marry into a high-born family. This was in spite of the fact that they could achieve a certain level of fame within the city from their day job. Almost everything he did was to stir up controversy. He had 3 wives during his short reign, the second of which, Livia or Astilia, he chose to marry on the day of her wedding to another man. Of course, her husband-to-be was a senator, and thus Caligula achieved in humiliating the man. Nothing pleased him more than to see these people squirm. When he abolished the reservation of seats in the arenas, he got immense pleasure in watching senators and equestrians scrabbling for places with the rest of the populace. Even the tale of Caligula wanting to appoint his favourite horse, Incitatus, to the consulship can be seen as humiliating the upper classes. He was essentially saying his horse was a better option than any of them. He wanted to bypass the meddling Senate and build strong relations between himself and the people, essentially giving himself absolute power. He was once recorded as saying to a group of senators, "Do not think me a fellow citizen of yours, though. As princeps, I no longer acknowledge the Senate." Once, he summoned 3 consulars to the palace in the middle of the night, and when they arrived in great and deathly fear, he seated them on a stage, and then, all of a sudden burst out with a great din of flutes and clogs, dressed in a cloak and a tunic reaching to his heels, and after dancing a number, went off again. The stories Suetonius tells us show the brutality of hate he felt towards the upper classes. When hearing the protestations of innocence uttered by an equestrian who was being thrown to the beasts, Caligula ordered him to be brought back from the jaws of the deadly animals, but only so that his tongue could be cut out before having him thrown back in. Towards the end of his reign, he had returned to Rome for his birthday after a short period away, and upon entering the city, showered the people with gold and silver coins thrown from the basilica roof. A stampede ensued, and countless civilians were crushed to death, including 200 women. Caligula, delighted with the outcome, continued to do this for the next few days, but the people loved him for it. Other instances enhance his growing reputation for acts of cruelty. He had the owner of a gladiator barracks beaten to death with a large chain over several days for his own amusement, only stopping when the smell of what was left of the man got too much to bear. He made parents witness the execution of their own sons, even inviting them to dinner after, and attempting to rouse them to dancing. This behaviour does seem to represent the Caligula we have come to expect. "Let them hate me, as long as they fear me," he is reported to have said in regard to the senators and aristocracy. No longer loved, he was indeed hated and feared. Although still regarded as somewhat strange behaviour, he was not too different from other emperors. His predecessor Tiberius's reign was filled with cruelty, and his successor, his uncle Claudius, no less murderous throughout his reign. The one aspect of these two men's reigns that differ from Caligula is that they kept Rome wealthy. They were brilliant financial operators. Context is key, and we must remember that histories were written by those with a vested interest in pleasing their ruler. Take, for example, Caligula's military campaign in Gaul in the year 39. Suetonius tells us that he was a useless military commander who was laughed at back in Rome, whereas the historian Cassius Dio explains that though Caligula had won no battle or slain no enemy, he was hailed imperator several times by the troops. Much of the source material must be viewed with the writer's biases in mind. Another example could be used as evidence that Caligula was indeed a monstrous and mad ruler. Standing on the coast of Western Gaul, with an army of hardened soldiers, Caligula was faced with a daunting and potentially reign-defining opportunity to cross the English Channel and invade Britannia, something his predecessors had failed to accomplish. Addressing his troops, he gave the order to collect musculi, and his soldiers waded into the water with intent. They returned with seashells, collected in their helmets and the folds of their clothes. Most probably bewildered and humiliated by the order, The issue with this story is that, taken at face value, it confirms our biases towards the narrative that Caligula was this mad, unhinged, and monstrous emperor. It's necessary, however, to do our homework. The word musculi did indeed mean shells, but it also meant military huts. So it is equally as likely Caligula was giving the order for his soldiers to collect the huts before leaving. Suetonius and later writers decided to use the shells story to back up their narrative that Caligula was mad, and the story stuck. Ultimately, his downfall was that he did not have a good relationship with the Senate and aristocracy, but nor did he want to. He despised both the men of the senatorial class and the leading families, and wanted to punish them by any and all means necessary. His reign can be seen as a struggle for power between emperor and senate, which came to an abrupt end by the sword of Chaerea, head of the Praetorian Guard, who along with other guards hacked the lifeless body of their former emperor to the extreme. Later, through the writings of men appealing to the classes Caligula so despised, he was painted as a mad and evil ruler, showcasing how powerful the pen can be. From this we learn that it is not the general population you must keep happy, but those around you who possess the power to wield the sword.